We're here with Professor Fazal Rizvi from Melbourne University. He's a professor of global studies in education, and he's also emeritus professor at University of Illinois. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fazal, perhaps we could start with the question of what do you see as the major trends in higher education globally?
From my view, the key idea that I summarize all the interesting and new things that are happening in higher education is the idea of privatization. Privatization not simply at one level, but number of different levels. How the governance is becoming privatized, how students' identity is becoming privatized, how the relationship between the state and the university is becoming privatized, and how privatization is defining a move away from public ownership of universities to private ownership. And from there flows a whole range of ideas about students and their relationship to the university, the issues of curriculum and knowledge, what is worth, investment in education, the public role of universities, and all those kind of things. So the central idea is privatization, growing privatization around the world, okay, largely as a result of massification of higher education, which the states feel that they cannot afford, and hence they're really keen to push it towards private sources of income for students and for universities. So to me, that is the overall, and if you like, the organizing idea around which I think about the trends that are taking place right now.
You have a lot of work on globalization and higher education in Asia, and those themes that you've spoken about, privatization, are sort of unfolding in that space. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, in Asia, the privatization is taking place slightly differently. I'm one of those people who does not believe that privatization is practiced, is thought about, and indeed is conceptualized in the same way in every country. So, for example, a country where I do work, where I was born, India, privatization has slightly different meaning to the ways in which it is meant in China, for example. In Australia, privatization is very differently configured to United States. So I think we shouldn't be thinking of privatization as a globally converging idea, but as an idea that has different meaning in different locations. So we've got to understand that while there is an element of global convergence, isomorphism if you like, there are also very major historical and political differences in the ways in which countries think about. In India, for example, just to follow up as an example, privatization is happening despite the fact that the state thinks that it is still in control of higher education. Okay. In other words, there is a huge amount of privatization that is coming up from below, while the government still pretends that it's in control of higher education. In China, it's completely the other way around. The government is in control of some of the processes of privatization, whereas in India, if you like, the civil society has taken over privatization and moves towards privatization. So India and China are working very differently, and yet both of them are moving away from public ownership of education to increasingly privatized ownership of university, but in ways that are very different. In India, there are a number of regulations, but India, in a democratic society, somewhat anarchic. Regulations don't mean as much as they do in China. In China, which is an authoritarian state to a large extent, the rules really are adhered to because you're always potentially in trouble. In India, people are always going to the limits of the rule and trying to test them. Okay, and they feel quite proud that they are testing them. So they say, we will do this despite the fact that we know that there is a rule preventing us from doing this, because if the government decides to take us to the court, it'll take them 20 years, and by that time, rules would have changed anyway. So can you see how the civil society itself is taking ownership of privatization? Whereas in China, it is actually being sort of managed and being played out in ways in which the state has determined is permissible and appropriate for it.
You mentioned the word investment.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit on which aspirations this investment, this increased investment, private and public, in higher education is.
Well, I think aspiration is a very interesting term, and I notice in a number of theoretical works, people have started working on the idea of aspirations. It really is an important idea. But we must distinguish between aspirations of the market, aspirations of the state, and aspirations of the individual students. They may not necessarily align with each other. Okay, so aspirations of the state may be motivated, may be driven by a particular set of concerns. Civil society and the market has different aspirations for higher education. Again, individuals have different aspirations which they are trying to somehow understand in relation to the aspirations of the market and aspirations of the state. So if you like, instead of thinking about privatization leading to only one set of aspirations, it's leading to multiple sets of aspirations which are having a difficulty in using a term that you used, assembling. So let me give you an example. A student, for example, has aspirations, and their aspirations are increasingly based not only on what they would like to do, but also in relation to a range of calculations about what they will be able to do in terms of their understanding of the ways in which market is growing and in the ways in which the state will permit them to do something. So my own understanding of students and their parents in higher education is that they are much more aware of this calculative logic than we quite often assume. They are figuring out. People like Io Ong, for example, who's written quite extensively on flexible citizenship, has written beautifully about this kind of calculative logic of trying to figure out not only what we desire, but what is possible for us to desire. So that makes it a very different kind of space, which we need to understand with multiple definitions of aspirations and multiple motivations towards aspirations. The market, of course, aspires from higher education a particular set of skills, particular sets of aptitudes, particular sets of dispositions. The state has slightly different. State would like to support the market, even encourage the market, but it has some additional requirements to which it aspires. Okay, so as a result, for example, the aspirations of social cohesion, so that the country doesn't fall apart, aspirations to make sure that the social conditions appropriate for capital accumulation, both individual level and at the level of the market, prevail. So state is managing and has aspirations differently, and each of those three groups, the students, the institutes, each of the four groups, the students, institutions, the market, and the state, have different aspirations, but these aspirations are, if you like, reflexive of their understanding of what the aspirations are of the other three. Okay, and they're basically negotiating this complex space. So when the state develops its policy, it does not only understand aspirations of the market and the market leaders, it also understands what it can expect its educational institutions to be able to do, but also has some general idea as to what the students want, and it tries to develop a policy regime that actually brings all these things together. In that sense, the term Io Ong and Collier have used, assemblage, is quite useful. To my mind, much more profoundly described than Deleuze, for example. I'm not all that convinced about Deleuze's reading of assemblage, but I personally go back to Stuart Hall and use his term of conjuncture. How do different ideas, different notions, and different interests come together in a conjunctural sense, and how at particular time certain conjunctures come together, okay, to form a particular understanding of privatization, for example. So my interest is in conjunctural, not conjectural, but conjunctural analysis of the ways in which these things are coming together.
You've presented a very interesting way in which the concept of aspiration and conjuncture bring these ideas together. But there's also to make a play on aspiration,
right.
a concept of anxiety
yes.
rather than just aspiration,
sure.
and perhaps they play together
yeah.
in higher education. Could you speak a bit?
Absolutely, absolutely. The students, each of these groups, if you like, the state, the market, the institutions, and students and their parents, live in a state of anxiety. And Ulrich Beck refers to as the risk society. You know, these need to be managed. These needs to be understood. And I think the anxiety really is, from the state's point of view, if we have these aspirations and the others do not, then we have a legitimation and motivation problem. These people won't buy into our agendas. And the same with market. If the market has aspirations, then, and the state doesn't play ball, then market cannot succeed to any. The students have the same problem. Okay? So anxiety and aspirations go together. But aspirations quite often framed within a particular understanding of anxiety, and anxieties are at each different level. So in that sense, there is a dialectical relationship between anxiety and aspiration, in which people are sort of saying, how do we manage the distinctive conjunctural conditions in which we find ourselves? Okay, how is it that we figure out this is the best way of working? This is the stuff of politics. This is really competing interest being negotiated across each other. Interest which were once interest being transformed into a different kind of interest in light of the impossibility of some anxieties being responded to appropriately. Okay, so people change. So there is a dynamism, there is conflict, and there is an intense politics in which groups, students, even individuals are trying to figure out how to be in this conjunctural set of conditions.
It seems to me that all these investments, aspirations, anxieties, they are framed within what we understand as the global knowledge economy.
Yes.
You have yourself talked before about social imaginaries as a way of understanding the spaces that we imagine that we share. I was wondering if I could ask you to elaborate on that.
Well, before I do that, I want to go back to global economy. My own view is that global economy has been mistakenly assumed to have one uniform meaning. It does not. Okay, global economy works differently in different conjunctural conditions. So, for example, we have become incredibly influenced by, if you like, an imaginary, and I'll come back to that, an imaginary of global economy, the ways in which it is thought about in our structures of feeling, by three major organizations: World Bank, OECD, and EU. Together, they have created a particular imaginary of global economy. Now, that global economy is not necessarily the global economy that the Chinese are thinking about or the Indians are thinking about. Okay, they have a slightly different view of global economy. I heard somebody, a Chinese academic, say that it's global economy from the Chinese model. Okay, the Chinese model of global economy. It has a different way of organizing the meaning that they give to the relationship between state, markets, individuals, and knowledge. Okay, the ways in which knowledge is thought about. So, for example, the ways in which knowledge is thought about has changed over the years and is constantly changing. Okay, as we think about new possibilities and new conditions. And I think the idea of knowledge economy is one that is now located, dominantly so, within a particular social imaginary. Now, what do I mean by social imaginary? I have to say that the term social imaginary, which has become quite well known now and has been used widely, some of it because I used it in a book a few years ago called Globalizing Educational Policy, and I've had to think. think about what it means much more, even after I'd written the book, which is the way that concepts developed and understanding develops. You use the concept because it made sense then, but then a lot of people sort of saying, look, we are not clear, explain. And that has helped you to expand your, not only meaning and elaborate your meaning, but also develop your understanding of the concept. So, the reason why I use the term social imaginary, borrowing very heavily from Charles Taylor, Carlos Castelladis, and various other people, including Benedict Anderson, Arjuna Pudurai is another one. Okay, different disciplines: philosophy, political science, anthropology. They're all coming together to talk about this particular concept. The reason why I was became attracted to the notion of social imaginary is because I did not think that the term ideology did the work that was necessary to be done. In other words, ideology is something that's articulated, that has a particular purpose. It has a telos. Okay, people know what that telos is, what kind of vision is being envisaged. Okay, imaginary is much looser. It is something that Raymond Williams called structure of feeling. It's the ways in which you imagine your present being linked to the future, okay? And the ways in which your future defines what you think are the conditions of living, okay? So in other words, to me, imaginary is a notion that is a collective notion that becomes absolutely widespread, okay, in a whole range of different ways. So people don't even bother thinking about what it means. It is, if you like, the framework, the template upon which particular concepts are negotiated, thought about, and changed in meaning. Okay, so that's actually what I mean by social imaginary. Social imaginary is something that that leads us to ask certain kinds of questions without asking some other questions. Okay, it actually breaks down certain distinctions that are very common in analytical philosophy between fact and value, between description and normative, between now and future. All of these distinctions, these are linear distinctions. I'm saying that it's possible to think about normative and descriptive thing at the same time. Your description is affected by your normativity, and your description in then turn affects the ways in which you think about normativity. Similarly with past and present. Much of what we describe as present quite often has elements of future in it. Okay, so that's actually what the term social imaginary does for me. It's very complicated to explain. I have tried my best over and over again, but I still require a concept that goes beyond ideology. That is, if you like, tacit, implicit, that defines the preamble, the template upon which we consider certain concepts like aspiration and even imagination. Imagination is done within imaginaries. This is a language of modality. This is a language of possibilities. This is a language of future. Okay, that against which we understand how we are and how we are located and what it is that we can do to position ourselves towards the future.
What do you think are the dominant imaginaries in higher education and society in general, and what effect does that have?
Sure. Well, I think we've already sort of talked about the neoliberal imaginary, social imaginary of knowledge economy. There is a huge amount that is taken for granted when we talk about knowledge economy. That is considered self-evident. That is not even named, let alone problematized. Okay, and some of those things are perhaps inarticulable, because they are so basic to our understanding of what humans are, how humans relate to each other, how humans relate to institutions and the markets and all those sort of things. So it's not even possible to do that. So dominant imaginary at the moment in Anglo-American world and increasingly European world is the neoliberal imaginary. that is, the state can't do very much, and that we have to figure out our futures in making the best of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, in the conjunctures in which we find ourselves. So those things become. So when a student is sitting down trying to figure out whether he'll do engineering or arts degree, okay, then the imaginary, the dominant neoliberal imaginary conceptions about the market of employability are embedded within that calculation. So if you like, those calculations become linked to the dominant imaginary. And there are dominant imaginaries that come and go. So for example, immediately after the war, the dominant imaginary was the imaginary of Keynesianism. The state has a major role to do. The state has requirements of making sure that there is fairer distribution, there is progressive taxation, and all those sort of things. I mean, that was an imaginary. The Thatcher and Reagan period totally destabilized that imaginary, but didn't succeed in institutionalizing neoliberalism until very recently. So in other words, it's 20 years' work that has institutionalized the imaginary.
Thank you, Fazal. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.